an alarm went off. One of the things that God placed on my heart early in the pandemic was that He slowly has been really trying to get me to see that people that I feel like are my enemies aren't really my enemies. That Satan is the real enemy. And so early on in the pandemic, I felt like the Lord was preparing me to love those who I feel was causing all of this pandemic stuff, the corrupt politicians, the people that didn't stand up, to the corruption, people that just went along to get people to shut up. The people that I was angry with, and I felt like the Lord was really, really testing me to love them, even though I felt like they had wronged me. I felt like they had wronged our country. I felt like He was saying that I needed to learn to do what Christ said in the Bible, where it says, love our enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And it's just been something that has just been getting stronger and stronger in my heart over the last 18 months. And I can honestly say I'm getting a little better at it. I didn't do so good in the beginning. I had multiple reminders, let's just put it that way, to love my enemy and pray for those who persecute me. And it's funny because I felt like, or I was so passionate about getting this concept because I felt like this was what was going to save me from going crazy or going down the rabbit hole. Excuse me. Pardon me. So, here it goes. Excuse me. So I wanted to challenge myself. So I have this big sign. It's like half the size of my garage door. And on the sign I have painted a giant red heart. And in the middle of the heart I have written, love your enemies. And it's basically as a reminder to me, and then maybe to everybody else too that drives by because I'm on a busy road, that to love your enemies, because it's so hard to do. And yeah, so every time I come or go from my home, I'm reminded of, because of this giant sign on my front of my house, to love my enemy. And it's really kept me in check, like when someone pulls out in front of me or whatever, to just, forgive, let it go, don't get mad, don't flip them off, don't give them the bird, and it's really forced me to live my faith because of that constant reminder, and it's been challenging, but it's been good. It's been really interesting to hold myself accountable by that giant sign I have out front. Anyway, the next verse, verse 26. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, because God knows we're human. We can't love our enemies on our own. That's insane. He knows that. But He tells us to do impossible things so that we depend on Him. He knows we need our help. And the Holy Spirit is there to help us. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit Himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And there have been many days that I have had wordless groans, or, screams of frustration, God knows, and I've been directing some of those more towards Him lately as I struggle, because I know that He understands, He understands the frustration of trying to do the right thing and then failing. And then verse 27, and He who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. That famous line, verse. And so often people misquote that. They say, all things work together, all things work together, and they forget that it says that God works all things for good. Not all things are good, but God will work them out for good to those who love him. And so I just have a really quick example today. I was on my way to the chiropractor, and the light turned yellow, meaning it was going to turn red. And instead of speeding up to go through it, I felt like he was saying, just stop. And I'm like, what? I'm already running late. Why should I stop? Well, I listened this time. I don't always listen to God's promptings, but this time I did. And as I was at the red light, this young gentleman pulled up in the turning lane next to me and gave me a thumbs up. And the reason he was giving me a thumbs up is on the side of my truck I have trust God, he's winning. And I knew at that moment that writing on my vehicle encouraged him. And if I would have went through that light, he would never saw my vehicle and never would have been encouraged. So I'm starting to listen to God's promptings more and more every day, because I'm realizing that it's just something simple like stopping at a light that I wouldn't necessarily stop at, because it was yellow, so technically I could have went through, but I just felt like God was saying stop, and so I did. And it was neat to know that my obedience led to somebody being encouraged, and so I'm getting better at that. In verse 29, for those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he called. Those he called, he justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. So God knows the future. He knows what's coming. He knows who's going to follow his will. And he will justify you through your obedience, through your willingness to pick up your cross and follow him. There's many crosses that have come along in a lot of our lives, and I'm starting to not buck them as much. I'm starting to accept some of the crosses that God has allowed in my life, and try to say, okay, if this happened, God allowed it to happen. That means that he can work good for it. And let me tell you, it doesn't always happen. Sometimes I throw my little temper tantrum first and get upset. God, why does this happen? Why can't you? Whatever. But I'm getting better at accepting his will, knowing that there's a plan, knowing that there's a purpose, knowing that he can work good out of this. Let's see, and then verse 31. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? And then verse 35. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or the sword? And none of those can. None of those things can separate us from God. The only person that goes anywhere when a person and God is separated, God doesn't go anywhere. It's only that person. That person is in utter control. Sorry, another stupid alarm went off and kicked me off my video. So anyway, so when a person is separated from God, it's not God that's left. It's that person that left God. They don't go anywhere. And so whenever we feel that God has deserted us, he hasn't. The only person that can ever separate us from God is us, our choices, our behaviors. It's kind of like, when you receive Jesus, you're kind of in his care, you're under his umbrella, and if you walk away out from underneath that umbrella of God's grace and you get rained on, that's not God's fault. You're the one that walked out from underneath his umbrella. And so I started to realize that whenever I'm struggling, I say, okay, did I do something that separated me from God? Did I, you know, did I accept an attitude? You know, am I walking away from God somehow by my attitude or my refusal to accept his will? You know, that's really the only thing that can separate us from God, is when we walk away from him. And so I'm starting to realize more often than not that when I feel depressed, when I feel hopeless, when I feel powerless, I run to his word. I run to him in prayer. I run, you know, to some place that I can find God in a more meaningful, intimate way. And for me as a Catholic, it's usually an adoration chapel, because he's physically there, present in the Eucharist. And for me, the Eucharist is like, you know, when you have a loved one and you go, you know, like a grandparent, you go to their house. It's so much more amazing to see them face to face than, you know, through prayer, which is like calling God on the phone, you know. You know, if I call up my grandparents, yes, it's awesome to talk to them on the phone, but it's even more amazing to visit them face to face, in person. And that's what the Eucharist is for Catholics, is God in person, in the flesh. And so I really love the Adoration Chapel. And I just go there and I say, all right, Lord, I don't know what I did to walk away, but help me to draw closer to you. Because somewhere in the Word it says that draw close to God and he will draw close to you. And then I listen. And I usually will find a thought or an impression on my heart about what I can do differently, you know, to get closer to God. Or, you know, maybe I didn't forgive somebody that hurt me, and that's what's, you know, blocking my relationship with God. Maybe it's he's allowed something to happen in my life and I'm mad about it. I'm just really ticked, and I'm like, no, I do not want this. And I'm fighting him on it. I'm not accepting it. That's one way that I can walk away from God. And then I don't have that connection that I used to. I don't have that, you know, that as close. So it's harder to hear his voice when, you know, when we put that distance between ourselves and God. And not accepting what he has for our life is, you know, putting distance between us. And it's so much easier when we just accept his will. You know, I'm pretty stubborn. I can admit I don't do that very often, but I'm starting to realize that it's just way easier and way less stressful if I just, all right, God, I understand this is what you want for my life. I don't like it. Help me to accept it. Because as, you know, as a human being, as someone who's stubborn, I'm struggling to accept your will. And that's all he wants. He just wants us to ask for his help. And he will give it to us. And it's just so amazing to have that kind of a relationship where we can ask for his help about anything. You know, it's anything from, Lord, help me get all this laundry done today, to, you know, Lord, help me be patient with this child of mine who's testing my patience. You know, it's just amazing to have that kind of an intimate relationship with our Creator. And it's just been quite a learning process. And I'm learning to accept and embrace his will more often, especially when it includes suffering, because I know that he can use it for good, because it says so right in his word that he will use all things. He doesn't just say all good things. He said all things. That means suffering. That means hardships. That means, you know, what our country is going through right now. It's just being ripped apart at the seams. And I know that God can use that for good. And I don't know how, but it says in his word that he can. And so I'm going to hold on to that promise. And I'm going to pray every day to accept His will, and I know He'll help me, because it says in His Word that if we ask anything in accordance with His will, He will give it to us. And I know it's His will that I accept His will. So I know He's going to help me do it. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share. And thank you for joining me this evening. And don't ever, ever forget, you too can be a prayer warrior. Good evening, Patriots. This is your American Prayer Warrior. And I just feel really led to share some amazing insights that I was given today during my prayer time as I was reading some very difficult verses. So they were difficult in the sense that it was hard to hear, but yet it was bittersweet, you know. It's kind of like when you have to wait for something, you know, you're excited because you're excited about getting what you're waiting for, but yet it's kind of bitter because you have to wait. So that's kind of what I felt like when I read these verses. And it was Romans, and then it was verse 17, and I think it was almost through the end of the chapter. But just kind of read and then do some commentary as I read these verses of some things that I heard the Lord say. So Romans 8, I forgot to say the chapter. Romans chapter 8, starting with verse 17. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God, and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in His sufferings, in order that we may also share in His glory. And the part that really hit me was that we are heirs of God and co-heirs of Christ if we share in His sufferings. So it's something that God wanted us to partner on, just like Jesus left heaven to suffer on earth as a man and live on earth and deal with the normal things of being hungry, of being in pain, of feeling lonely, or just the different human conditions that Jesus suffered, even before He suffered on the cross. And so this verse really hit home. I'd never really heard it placed like this before, or said like this before. It says, if indeed we share in His sufferings, in order that we may also share in His glory. So we must die to ourselves like Christ did. He said, not my will, but yours, Father. So in other words, we need to die to ourselves, our will, what we want, and then we will share in His glory in heaven. And it just was really interesting because I'd never thought about it that way before. And so it kind of gives a value to suffering. And right now there's so much going on. There is a lot of suffering. And I felt like the Lord was saying that there is a value in what's happening. There's a value in the struggle, in the pain, and the suffering that is going on right now, that He can use it for His glory, and that He can use our suffering as a way to help redeem other souls for Him. And then it goes on, verse 18, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation awaits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in the pangs of childbirth right up to this present moment. And here's a really important verse. Not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait patiently for it. And it just kind of reiterated for me that there's a verse, and I can't remember it offhand, where it talks about that we work out our salvation in fear and trembling. And I kind of feel like this verse really reiterates that the human condition and free will, that suffering is a part of that, and that God has a plan and a purpose. I know there have been a couple of times when someone asked me, they said, how can you have hope when all this insanity is going on? And I realized that they saw suffering in my life, but they also saw the hope. And because of that, not understanding how I could do that, it opened them up to understanding and asking me how I could be hopeful, even in such tumultuous situations. And that's the kicker. That's the opportunity that God will give us to share with other people where our hope comes from. You know, because some people grow up in the church. They hear about God all the time and they don't have a personal relationship with Him. They don't understand that He can give them hope, that He can give them purpose, that suffering has a purpose. I mean, Christ dying on the cross, His suffering had a purpose. And He wants us to be co-heirs, as it says, co-heirs with Christ, so that if we suffer like He did, we will also have glory like He did. And when we live our lives as an example of how Christ lived His life, you know, not losing hope, finding joy in the Scriptures, finding joy amidst suffering, that will lead people to be like, what's going on? What do they have? And then it will give you an opportunity to be an amazing witness for Jesus. And people will be drawn to you to try to understand how you can endure, because your life is different than the rest of the world's, or we're supposed to be called to be different from the rest of the world. We're supposed to we're called to love those, you know, that are the hardest to love. One of the things that was put early on